It is the summer of 1722. A pirate crew on the West Africa coast spots a sail on the horizon. Someone passes a spyglass. The shape comes into focus. Tall masts, a long, low hull. Gun ports in a clean row. One word moves through the ship like a wave. Frigate. We're going back to the age when one type of warship ruled the ocean and ended the golden age of piracy. A ship built to chase, to fight, and to win. We will stand on its deck, feel the guns shake the air, and watch the sea change forever. If you enjoy this, a like and subscribe keeps these stories coming. Now settle in. We are going back. A pirate lookout is pressed against the bow of a converted merchant sloop somewhere off the Jamaican coast, and the morning is going fine until it isn't. The year is 1719. The sea is flat and bright. The crew below is eating, arguing, sleeping off the night before. Up on the bow, the lookout has a spyglass to his eye, and he is scanning the distance the way he does every morning, mostly looking for merchant sails, the kind that mean easy money and a quick job. Then he sees it, a shape on the horizon. He steadies the glass. Tall masts, a long, low hull that sits close to the water with a kind of confidence. And then the detail that changes everything. A row of gun ports running the length of the ship, each one a dark square, perfectly even, like windows in a building you do not want to enter. He doesn't shout. He just says the word, and the word travels. Frigate. You can feel what happens next without being told. The eating stops, the arguments stop. Men who were asleep a second ago are suddenly on their feet. A pirate ship runs on a kind of shared arithmetic, and the math of what a frigate means is very simple. More guns, faster hull, trained crew, a captain with legal authority to hang every man on this vessel from the nearest yardarm. The only good move is to run. But here is the thing about a frigate. It was built specifically so that running would not work. Imagine a greyhound crossed with a cannon. That is roughly what a frigate was. It had the speed of a racing dog and the bite of something much heavier. It was long and narrow at the waterline, which meant it cut through swells instead of climbing over them the way rounder hulls did. Its single main gun deck sat low, close to the sea surface, which kept it stable in rough water even when its guns were hot and its crew was running across the planks at full sprint. A pirate sloop might have 8 guns and 40 men. A frigate carried 30 guns or more and a crew that had been drilled, punished, starved, and trained into something close to a single organism. The lookout knows this. Every pirate who has spent more than a season at sea knows this. The captain is already at the stern. The helmsman is already turning the wheel. Every spare hand is moving to the rigging to pull more canvas out of the yards, to catch whatever wind is available, to squeeze every fraction of a knot out of a ship that was never designed to outrun what is now following it. The frigate does not change course dramatically. It does not fire a warning shot yet. It simply adjusts, slowly, deliberately, the way a large predator adjusts when prey starts moving, with a patience that is somehow worse than speed. The distance between the two ships is maybe 4 miles. That is roughly the length of Central Park from bottom to top, stretched across open water. In a racing sloop with a clean hull and good wind, it might take 20 minutes to open that to 6 miles, maybe 7. Enough to escape into a coastline or a cove. But this particular morning the wind is light, and the frigate's hull is copper-sheathed and clean, and the frigate's captain has done this before. The sloop is not going to make it, and somewhere on the frigate's deck an officer lifts his own glass, finds the pirate ship in his lens and watches it run. He has seen this before, too. What happens in the next hour will depend on choices made long before either ship left the port, choices about wood and rope and copper and cannon and the kind of men you put behind each gun. The story of why the frigate always won starts much earlier than this morning. It starts with a problem that empires couldn't solve until they built the right ship to solve it. Stand on a dock in the early 1700s and watch the ships move in and out of harbour, and you start to notice that they are not all built the same way. Some are massive. 3 decks of guns stacked on top of each other, hulls so wide they look almost square from the front, so heavy they seem to press the water down rather than float on it. Those are the ships of the line, the battleships of their age. They exist to smash other big ships in set-piece battles where 2 fleets line up and pound each other until one side sinks or surrenders. Then, at the other end of the harbour, there are the small ones. Sloops, brigs, schooners. Quick, light, easy to handle with a small crew. Good for short runs, shallow waters, carrying messages. Pirates loved them because a good sloop could disappear into a river mouth or a cove where a bigger vessel couldn't follow. And in between these two worlds, something else. Something long. Noticeably long for its width. 2 masts rigged with a combination of square sails and triangular ones, designed to catch wind from multiple directions. A single gun deck, but a long one, studded with ports that could open to reveal cannon mouths on either side. The hull sits lower in the water than you would expect for a ship that size, like it has been pressed down by a hand. That is a frigate. Shipbuilders in the 1700s understood something that feels obvious once you see it. A hull that is wide carries more cargo or more guns, but it pushes more water out of the way as it moves, which means it needs more wind to get moving and stays slower overall. A hull that is narrow and long slides through the water like a blade. Less resistance, more speed. The frigate was the result of decades of experimenting with that idea. Navies tried different lengths, different ratios of width to length, different placements for the gun deck. The French were particularly good at this, and built frigates that were widely agreed to be among the fastest afloat in the early 1700s. The British copied French designs whenever they could, sometimes literally measuring captured French ships inch by inch, and using those numbers to build their own. The result was a ship that could do things nothing else could. It could sail in water shallow enough that the big battleships had to anchor and wait. It could maintain a chase for days without exhausting its crew the way a smaller sloop would. It could fight a converted merchant vessel and win in under an hour. And it could scout ahead of a fleet, disappear over the horizon, and come back with information about what lay ahead. Navy commanders called frigates the eyes of the fleet. Pirates called them something less polite. The key was the single gun deck. A ship of the line had guns on 2 or 3 decks stacked vertically, which made it tall and slightly top-heavy in rough seas, which limited where it could safely go. A frigate's guns were all on one level, low down, which kept the centre of gravity low and let the ship handle storms that would force a battleship to close its lower gun ports entirely or risk flooding. Speed, reach, stability, fighting power. For a pirate sloop running with stolen cargo and a crew that had been awake for 2 days, encountering a frigate was like a bicycle meeting a police motorcycle on an empty highway. The gap in capability was that stark, and yet the frigate had not always existed. Something had to go wrong in the world first, badly enough that empires decided to pour money and timber and engineering talent into solving the problem. Something had to make ordinary warships useless enough that a new kind of ship became necessary. That something happened slowly, then all at once, in the years following a war that left thousands of trained, hungry, violent sailors with no employer and no pay. The war ended in 1713 and almost immediately created a monster. The War of the Spanish Succession had pulled most of Europe into a grinding, decade-long conflict. Navies grew enormous. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands all built or pressed into service hundreds of ships and recruited tens of thousands of sailors to man them. At the peak of the war, the Royal Navy alone had over 40,000 men at sea. Then the peace treaty arrived. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, brought the fighting to a close. Governments across Europe looked at their bloated military budgets and did what governments always do after wars. They cut them. Ships were laid up in harbour, their rigging removed, their crews dismissed. Soldiers and sailors who had spent years learning how to fight were simply handed a few coins and pointed toward the docks. No jobs, no pension, no plan. Tens of thousands of trained sailors were now loose in port cities from Bristol to Tortuga, with skills that were only useful at sea and very little reason to obey any law that stood between them and a meal. Some found work on merchant ships, some begged, some starved, and some, a smaller but very significant group, went pirate. The years between roughly 1715 and 1726 are now called the Golden Age of Piracy. That name sounds glamorous. The reality was uglier. It was a crime wave born from poverty and desperation, fed by the geography of the Caribbean and the enormous wealth moving through it on slow, lightly defended merchant ships. Pirates set up bases on islands like New Providence in the Bahamas, where a town called Nassau became effectively a pirate republic for a few years. Hundreds of ships operated out of there. They preyed on Spanish treasure ships, British merchants, Portuguese slavers, anyone who was on the water with something worth taking. The merchant companies that moved goods across the Atlantic started screaming at their governments. Insurance rates for Caribbean voyages tripled. Some captains refused to sail certain routes at all. The money flowing out of the colonies was at risk, and that got the attention of people with real power very quickly. Britain, Spain, and other naval powers had ships they could send. But the problem was that the ships they had were mostly designed for the wrong job. A ship of the line was a battering ram built for fleet battles. Send it after a pirate sloop and it couldn't follow the sloop into shallow water, couldn't match its maneuverability in tight coastal areas, and burned through its crew's energy just trying to keep up in a straight chase. It was like sending a freight train to catch a dirt bike. Smaller Navy vessels could go where the pirates went, but they often didn't carry enough guns to win a serious fight if the pirates decided to stand and battle rather than run. The problem needed a specific solution. A ship fast enough to chase a sloop, tough enough to win the fight at the end of the chase, able to operate in shallow coastal waters, far from naval bases for extended periods. What navies realized, some faster than others, was that they needed a ship designed for exactly this kind of work, a purpose-built hunter. The frigate already existed in rough form, but the pirate crisis pushed navies to refine and multiply it. More copper on the hull to fight barnacles during long patrols, more guns than a sloop, fewer than a ship of the line, in exactly the right balance. Crews large enough to fight, small enough to feed on a long voyage. The frigate became the anti-piracy weapon of the age, and the pirates, watching them appear in increasing numbers on familiar horizons, had to start changing how they operated. Some ran, some hid, some tried to fight back. The outcomes of those choices were rarely good for the pirates. Run your hand along a frigate's hull at the waterline, and you feel something that surprises you. Copper. Thin sheets of it, hammered flat and nailed over the oak planking below the waterline in overlapping rows, the way roof tiles overlap to shed rain. In the sunlight, when the ship heels over in a strong wind, that underwater copper flashes green gold in the shallows. It is almost beautiful in a functional way, but it was not put there for beauty. A wooden ship's bottom is a living ecosystem of things that want to destroy it. Barnacles, small crustaceans that attach themselves to any hard surface and grow into crusted colonies. Shipworm, which is not actually a worm but a clam that drills into wood with a rotating shell and hollows out a plank from the inside while leaving the surface looking almost intact. In warm Caribbean or Atlantic water, a ship's hull could go from clean to fouled in a matter of weeks. A badly fouled hull lost a third of its speed or more. Every wooden warship dealt with this. The normal solution was careening, pulling the ship onto a beach and rolling it on its side to scrape and tar the bottom. It worked, but it took time and a safe beach and left the ship completely defenceless while it was happening. For a pirate hunter on a long patrol far from a naval base, it was a serious problem. Copper plating changed the equation completely. Barnacles could not attach to copper the way they attach to wood. Shipworm could not drill through it. A copper-sheathed hull stayed cleaner for months longer than a wood-only hull, which meant a frigate on a long patrol stayed faster longer. It meant the speed advantage the frigate already had over a pirate sloop did not erode the way it once had. Navies started widely adopting copper sheathing in the 1770s, and the effect on long-distance naval operations was dramatic. Frigates could stay out longer. They came back faster after resupply. Their captains spent less time worrying about the bottom and more time worrying about the horizon. But the copper was just the skin. The real strength of a frigate was in its bones. The main structural member running the length of the ship from bow to stern was the keel, a single long timber of dense oak that everything else attached to. Ribs curved up from the keel like the bones of a fish, giving the hull its shape. Planking ran lengthwise over those ribs, pegged and caulked with oakum, a fibrous material hammered into the seams and sealed with hot tar to keep the sea out. The gun deck ran the length of the ship, a few feet above the waterline, supported by heavy beams. The gun ports cut into the hull sides were reinforced with extra framing, because the shock of firing a cannon transferred enormous force into the ship's structure. A frigate that had been firing its guns in a prolonged fight sometimes showed sprung planks and loosened caulking by the end of the engagement. Above the hull, the masts. A mainmast that might reach over 150 feet from keel to truck, the wooden cap at the very top, a foremast forward, a shorter mizzenmast aft. Each mast was not one piece of wood but several, joined with iron bands and rope lashings, because no single tree grew straight and tall enough to make a full mast. The forests of North America supplied much of this timber. One-risen colonial resources mattered enormously to naval power. The rigging connecting all of this was miles of rope. Standing rigging, tarred and thick, held the masts in place. Running rigging, thinner and supple, moved the sails. A frigate's crew spent a significant portion of every day maintaining, replacing and adjusting that rope network, because a line that parted at the wrong moment could bring down a mast and end a chase in seconds. All of this together, copper, oak, rope and iron, created a machine of rare efficiency. And behind every gun port was the next part of the equation. The people who made it work were not born knowing how. They were made. The boy is 12 years old, and he is standing on a dock in Portsmouth, England, watching a naval officer move through the crowd with a small group of armed sailors behind him. The year is 1718. The officer is looking for bodies. Warm, able-bodied men between roughly 15 and 55 who can haul rope, follow orders, and survive at sea. He carries a warrant from the Navy Board that gives him legal authority to take them whether they want to go or not. This is the press gang, and it is how a significant portion of Royal Navy crews were assembled during the age of the frigate. The officer moves through the dock workers, the tavern crowd, the men just off a merchant ship. He's looking for calloused hands, a certain way of walking on an uneven surface, the physical marks of sea experience. When he finds a likely candidate, the conversation is brief. The man is invited to volunteer for the King's service. If he declines, the sailors behind the officer step forward. The pressed men were marched to the ship and locked below until it left harbour, because a pressed man given a chance to run will run. But pressed men were only part of a frigate's crew. Others volunteered, some because they were starving, some because they wanted the prize money that came from capturing enemy ships or pirate vessels, some because they genuinely loved the sea and the structure of naval life in a way that sounds strange until you realise that for a man with no property and no prospects on land, a ship offered food, shelter, a clear hierarchy, and the occasional chance at real money. And then there were the boys. Ship's boys, some of them as young as 10 or 12, served as powder monkeys during battle. Their job was to carry cartridges of gunpowder from the magazine deep in the ship's hold up to the gun crews on the main deck. They ran through smoke and noise and chaos, crouching low, moving fast, because the gun crews above them could not reload if the powder didn't arrive. The captain of a frigate shaped all of these people, pressed men, volunteers and boys, into something that could function as a unit. Drills were the mechanism. Gun drills repeated until the crew could run out a cannon, load it, fire it, swab the barrel, reload, and fire again in under 90 seconds. Sail drills, where the crew scrambled aloft in darkness or rain to reef or set canvas on command. Man overboard drills, fire drills. The frigate was a wooden ship full of gunpowder and hot iron. Fire was not a remote possibility. It was a constant threat. The routine of a frigate was grinding. Watches rotated every 4 hours around the clock. A sailor might get 4 hours of sleep, then 4 hours of standing watch in cold rain, then 4 hours of work on rigging or guns, then another 4 hours of watch. Week after week, month after month. Discipline was physical. A sailor who fell asleep on watch or failed to obey an order quickly enough could be flogged in front of the crew. The captain had nearly total authority over life aboard the ship, restrained mainly by naval regulations and his own judgment, and yet crews bonded. Men who had been pressed aboard against their will became loyal to their ship and their messmates, the small group of 8 or 10 men they ate and slept alongside. A frigate crew that had survived a bad storm together, or stood their guns together in a fight, became something tight and almost tribal. That cohesion was the hidden weapon. A pirate crew had freedom. A Navy frigate crew had training, structure, and collective muscle memory. When the two met, it rarely ended well for the pirates, but sometimes it did, in ways nobody saw coming. The captain's cabin is at the very stern of the ship, and it is the closest thing to a private room that exists on a frigate. Closest thing, relative term. The space is maybe 12 feet wide and 14 feet long. The curved windows across the back look out over the ship's wake, which on a clear day stretches in a pale green line toward the horizon. There is a table bolted to the floor with charts on it, a chair, a cot that folds against the wall, a lantern hung from a beam. In rough weather, everything not bolted down slides and crashes. The sound of the sea is constant, the creak of the hull, the rush of water past the stern, the drumming of rope against wood up on deck. This is where the captain lives, eats, sleeps, and thinks. And in the age of the frigate, a ship's captain was one of the most powerful individuals in the world on a practical moment-to-moment level. He had authority over every person on the ship. He could punish, promote, reassign, and in extreme circumstances execute. He made decisions that would not be reviewed by any superior officer for weeks or months, because communication across an ocean in 1720 still meant physically sailing a dispatch ship to the nearest port. If a captain made a wrong call on the other side of the Atlantic, no one who outranked him would hear about it until the ship came home. That isolation produced two kinds of captains. The first kind grew into their authority carefully. They maintained discipline but were not arbitrary. They shared information with their officers. They knew the names of their men. These captains tended to have crews that fought hard because the crew trusted that the man at the top knew what he was doing. The second kind let the isolation curdle. Absolute power on a small wooden ship, far from oversight, did something to certain men. They became petty and cruel, handing out floggings for minor infractions, playing favourites, making decisions based on wounded pride rather than good judgment. These captains still got performance from their crews because the penalties for failure were severe. But performance under fear and performance under trust look the same on a calm day, and diverge sharply when things go wrong. A frigate captain also carried an enormous weight of practical knowledge. He had to understand navigation, which in the 1700s meant calculating position from sun and star sightings using a sextant and a chronometer, and accepting that a small error in the calculation meant you might be 10 or 20 miles from where you thought you were. He had to understand weather, reading cloud formations and wind shifts and the colour of the water for information about what was coming. He had to understand the fighting capacity of every gun on his ship, the strength of his rigging, the depth of water in the channels he was sailing through, and he had to understand his enemy. A frigate captain hunting pirates spent real time learning how pirates moved, which islands offered careening beaches, which months brought storms that would push pirate vessels into certain predictable routes, which captains were bold enough to fight, and which would run at the first sight of a naval vessel. Knowing that a specific pirate would run rather than fight changed how you approached the chase. You gave yourself space to maneuver, cut off escape routes before the pirate could take them, pushed him toward a lee shore where the wind would work against him. It was a chess game played across hundreds of miles of open water, and the most famous games of that chess match were about to be played in the shallow inlets and dark river mouths of the American coastline. One name in particular was about to dominate that board. The Caribbean in 1715 smells like salt and opportunity and slow decay. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, is a town of maybe 1,000 people and no functioning government. The fort that was supposed to protect it sits half collapsed. The governor has fled. The streets closest to the waterfront are loud at all hours with men who have money from somewhere and are spending it on rum and dice, and nothing that requires them to be anywhere at a fixed time. On the water around Nassau, there are ships of every size and description. Some are legitimate traders, most are something else. They carry no national flag, or carry one that is switched out depending on who is approaching. Their holds have recently contained things that were not their captain's property. Their crews have histories they don't discuss in polite company. This is the Pirate Republic of Nassau, and for a few years in the early 1700s, it operates almost openly. The pirates who base themselves here are not a unified organisation. They are loose networks of crews with overlapping personal histories. Many of them sailed together in the war, on privateers, ships hired by governments to raid enemy merchant vessels. When the war ended, the privateering licenses expired, but the men who held them had no other income and a very particular set of skills. The targets were obvious. Spanish treasure ships moving silver from South America to Spain. English merchant vessels carrying sugar, tobacco and cotton from the American colonies to European markets. Portuguese ships on the Brazil route. French vessels in the Windward Islands. The sea lanes of the Caribbean and the North Atlantic were carrying more wealth than at almost any other point in history, and much of it moved in ships that were lightly armed and understaffed. A pirate crew of 60 men on a fast sloop could take a merchant vessel in under an hour. They came up fast, fired a shot across the bow, and most merchant captains surrendered immediately. The math was obvious. Die fighting for the cargo company's insurance claim, or survive by handing over the goods. Most chose to survive. This worked for a few years, and then the complaints got loud enough that governments acted. The Royal Navy began sending more frigates to the Caribbean in 1717 and 1718 under a deliberate strategy. The governor of the Bahamas, a man named Woodes Rogers, arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a squadron of warships and a royal proclamation. Pirates who surrendered and accepted a pardon could walk free. Those who refused were enemies of the crown and would be treated accordingly. Some took the pardon. Some, looking at the navy ships in the harbour and calculating their odds, decided that a pardon and a life somewhere on shore was better than a rope. But some refused, and for those who refused, the frigates were now an active threat in waters they had treated as their own for years. The balance of the Caribbean was shifting. The open commerce of piracy was being pushed out of the main ports, into smaller islands, into riskier waters, into decisions that would end careers and lives in quick succession. And the most dramatic of those endings was about to happen in a shallow North Carolina inlet on a cold November morning, involving a man with a black beard that he reportedly tied with red ribbons before a fight. The inlet is narrow, not much wider than a football field, and the water is shallow enough that the big Navy ships cannot come in. Edward Teach, the pirate known as Blackbeard, knows this. He's chosen Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast deliberately. His ship, the Adventure, draws only a few feet of water. A Navy frigate draws much more. The math, in his calculation, protects him. He is partly right. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, has been furious about Blackbeard for years. The pirate has been raiding up and down the colonial coast, taking merchant ships, blockading the port of Charleston for several days in 1718, operating with a boldness that makes Spotswood look powerless. The governor cannot bring Navy frigates into the inlet, so he does something clever. He hires smaller vessels, 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, commanded by a Navy officer named Robert Maynard. These ships draw shallow enough to follow Blackbeard into his anchorage. They carry fewer guns than a frigate and fewer men, but they carry enough, and they carry the element of surprise. On the night of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's sloops sail into Ocracoke Inlet in the dark. Blackbeard's crew has spent the evening drinking. The lookout spots the approaching ships late, and by the time the alarm goes up, the sloops are already committed to the inlet. The morning of November 22nd begins with the Adventure opening fire. Blackbeard has positioned his ship to fire a broadside directly at the approaching vessels, and the effect is brutal. The first volley tears into Maynard's crew, killing and wounding dozens and disabling the Ranger almost immediately. Maynard on the Jane takes heavy losses. He orders most of his surviving men below decks, out of sight, to create the impression that his ship has been nearly wiped out. Blackbeard brings the Adventure alongside, expecting a boarding action against a nearly defeated vessel. His men swarm over the rail, and Maynard's men come up from below. The fighting on the deck of the Jane is described in survivor accounts as close, savage, and very fast. Blackbeard is in the middle of it. He takes musket balls, sword cuts, keeps fighting. The accounts say he received 5 bullet wounds and 20 sword cuts before he finally died. Some of those accounts are probably exaggerated, but even the conservative version is remarkable. Maynard had Blackbeard's head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop for the sail back to port. The message was deliberate. Governments wanted pirates to see what the end of the road looked like. But Blackbeard's death, as dramatic as it was, did not end piracy in the Caribbean. Other names were rising, other ships were moving through those waters, and some of those pirates were smarter, more organised, and harder to catch than the man whose head now swung from a rope off a Virginia dock. One of them was already at sea, building a fleet, and he would become the most successful pirate in history before a frigate finally caught up with him. The moment a pirate captain identified a frigate on the horizon, a calculation began. It happened fast because it had to. How far away was the ship? How strong was the wind? Which direction was it blowing, and would it help or hurt a run for the nearest coastline? How clean was the sloop's hull? How far was the nearest shallow water where the frigate couldn't follow? These were not abstract questions. They were survival arithmetic, and the men doing the math had usually been sailors for years. They knew the variables. They ran the numbers in their heads while the frigate was still a shape on the horizon, because the decision to run or to strike colours, to lower your flag in surrender, had to be made while there was still time for it to matter. Running made sense if the math worked. A sloop with a clean hull, a strong wind from behind, and a coastline with shallow inlets within 30 or 40 miles had a real chance. The frigate might pursue for hours and then turn back, especially if it was on a broader mission and could not afford to spend 2 days chasing a single vessel. But if the wind was light, if the hull was fouled, if there was open ocean in every direction, the math went the other way. A frigate in those conditions was not going to lose a chase. It would walk the sloop down over the course of an afternoon, slowly, inexorably, the way a long-distance runner catches a sprinter after the first mile. Striking colours was the maritime tradition of lowering your flag to signal surrender. It carried a specific social weight. A ship that struck its colours was asking for mercy, and there was a long tradition in naval warfare of granting it. Prisoners were taken, crews were often released or pressed into service, ships were seized as prizes. Pirates who struck colours to a navy ship gave up the cargo, gave up the ship, and gambled on what happened next. Some were imprisoned, some were hanged. Some, especially in the early years when governments were trying to encourage surrender with amnesty offers, walked free. The calculation was always the same: certain death in a fight you cannot win, versus uncertain but possible survival if you stop. Most pirates made the rational choice. The ones who did not, who fired back at frigates with their 8 guns against 30, who tried to board a vessel crewed by trained sailors rather than surrendering to them, those engagements were short and brutal. There is a documented record of what a frigate's broadside did to a pirate sloop at close range. The guns on a frigate fired iron balls roughly the size of a large grapefruit, some of them weighing 12 pounds, at a velocity that punched through oak planking and sent wooden splinters, sharp as spear points, flying across an enclosed deck. A single broadside from a frigate could put 12 men on the ground in seconds. Pirates generally understood this without needing to experience it personally, so the preferred strategy, when running failed, was a quick strike of colours and a hope that the officer standing on the frigate's deck was having a reasonable day. Some were not. And far from the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, a different set of pirates was calculating these same odds against a different set of frigates in waters even further from help. The spice trade made certain men fabulously wealthy and made others pirates. In the 1600s and early 1700s, the sea routes between Europe and Asia carried goods of almost unimaginable value. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, silks, and dyes moved from ports in India, the East Indies, and Arabia onto European ships, crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the tip of Africa, and arrived in London or Amsterdam or Lisbon worth many times their original purchase price. The ships carrying these goods were among the richest targets on Earth, and some men who had access to fast vessels and desperate crews decided that taking them was more efficient than trading for them. The Indian Ocean pirates who operated in the late 1600s and early 1700s were a different breed from the Caribbean crews. Some were English, some were American colonists, some were of mixed backgrounds from every port the trade routes touched. They operated from bases on the eastern coast of Madagascar, particularly a sheltered harbour that became known as a free zone for pirates, where ships could careen, trade and recruit without interference. The targets were spectacular. One ship taken by a privateer turned pirate in 1695 was one of the Mughal emperor's own vessels on pilgrimage from India to Arabia. It carried passengers, cargo, and gold worth an enormous fortune. The attack caused a diplomatic crisis between England and the Mughal Empire that shook the East India Company to its foundations and forced the English government to take Indian Ocean piracy seriously. Navy frigates began appearing in the Indian Ocean with greater frequency in the early 1700s. The routes were long, the bases few, and the logistics brutal. A frigate sent from England to patrol Madagascar was on its own for months at a time, dependent on friendly ports in India or the African coast for resupply. But the frigates came, And they changed things. The pirates who had operated relatively openly from their Madagascar base began to find it increasingly difficult. A frigate anchored off the harbour entrance made recruiting, careening and trading nearly impossible. Ships trying to enter or leave the pirate anchorage had to calculate whether the navy vessel would give chase, and increasingly the answer was yes. Some pirate captains abandoned the Indian Ocean entirely and moved operations back toward the Atlantic. Others tried to outlast the patrols, waiting in hidden inlets while the frigate patrolled elsewhere. It was a war of patience and geography, and one particular island in the Indian Ocean had become such a well-known pirate base that its name appeared on Navy charts as a target. The frigate that sailed toward St. Marie off the eastern coast of Madagascar was sailing toward a settlement that had grown around a shared agreement. This is a place where certain rules do not apply. That agreement was about to be tested. Imagine a green island rising out of the Indian Ocean, roughly the size of Los Angeles County, off the northeastern coast of Madagascar. Ile Sainte-Marie, or St. Mary's Island as English sailors called it, had a harbour on its western side that was protected deep and invisible from the open sea until you were almost in it. For a ship that needed to careen its hull, resupply with fresh water and food, and avoid the attention of naval authorities, the harbour was close to perfect. By the 1690s it was a functioning pirate settlement. A few hundred people lived there permanently, including pirates who had retired with enough money to stop, local Malagasy people who found the trade valuable, and merchants who had decided that selling to pirates was more profitable than worrying about the legality of it. There were houses, a small church reportedly built by a pirate who felt guilty about something, and a bay full of ships in various states of repair. Word of the place spread among sailors the way information always moved in that world, through port taverns, through shared voyages, through the network of men who knew men who had been places. If you needed a place to go that was not on any governor's list of places where warrants were served, St. Mary's was on the mental map. At its peak, some historians estimate several hundred pirates lived on or around the island at any given time. Ships moved in and out. Stolen goods were traded. Crew members who had made enough money bought small plots of land from local chiefs and stopped sailing. It was not a stable arrangement. Pirates are, by definition, people who operate outside law and hierarchy. A community of pirates is not a democracy or a republic in any structured sense. Disputes were settled personally and sometimes violently. Alliances formed and dissolved based on opportunity. The common interest in keeping the location quiet was the closest thing to a governing principle. But that common interest held for years. Then the frigates began arriving. A naval presence off St. Mary's Island did not have to enter the harbour to be effective. Simply anchoring off the approaches meant that any ship trying to leave had to deal with the possibility of being followed and taken. The psychological pressure of a frigate sitting on the horizon changed the island's economy. Merchants stopped coming. Supplies grew expensive. Men who'd been comfortable started calculating whether the island was still worth the risk. Some pirates moved. Some scattered to smaller anchorages along the Madagascar coast. Some gave up the trade entirely and tried to blend into local populations. The island did not disappear overnight, but its role as the centre of Indian Ocean piracy faded under consistent naval pressure. By the 1720s it was a fraction of what it had been. This is how frigate patrols actually worked against pirates. Seldom through dramatic chases and boarding actions, mostly through presence, through making certain places too risky to use, certain routes too dangerous to sail, certain careers too short to be worth starting. But sometimes the frigates got their dramatic moment, and one of those moments, off the coast of West Africa, would end the career of the pirate who had taken more ships than anyone else in the entire Golden Age. The morning of February 10th, 1722, begins with fog off Cape Lopez on the West African coast. Bartholomew Roberts is at anchor in the bay. His ship, the Royal Fortune, is a large frigate-class vessel that Roberts captured from a French warship and rearmed to his liking. By this point in his career, Roberts has taken somewhere in the range of 400 ships over 3 years. He has operated across the Caribbean, along the North American coast, and now on the West African slave trade routes, taking slaving ships and merchant vessels with a confidence that borders on arrogance. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most successful pirate in the history of the Atlantic, and the Royal Navy has been looking for him for a long time. The HMS Swallow is a Navy frigate, 50 guns, commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle. Ogle has been hunting Roberts across the African coast for months. On this particular morning, the Swallow is returning to the area after chasing away what turned out to be a different pirate vessel, and it re-enters the bay to find Roberts still there. Roberts spots the Swallow. His crew, many of them still drunk from the night before, scrambles to stations. Roberts makes a decision that surprises Ogle. He does not run. He chooses to fight his way out of the bay, bring his ship broadside to broadside with the Swallow, and punch through. The two ships close on each other. Roberts is standing on the Royal Fortune's deck in the clothes he is famous for wearing in battle. A rich crimson waistcoat and breeches, a large red feather in his hat, gold chain around his neck, pistols hanging from a silk sling across his chest. He is watching the Swallow come in. A grape-shot round, a cluster of small iron balls fired together from a single cannon, hits Roberts in the throat. He falls. His crew, who loved him, who had sailed with him for years, throws his body over the side according to his standing order. He had told them he did not want to be taken or displayed by the Navy. Within hours, most of his crew surrenders. The subsequent trial at Cape Coast Castle in West Africa sentences 52 pirates to death. They are hanged in batches and their bodies displayed in iron cages along the coast, as a warning to anyone still considering the trade. Roberts's death is widely understood by historians as the effective end of the golden age of piracy's peak years. The most capable, most prolific pirate of the age had run into a frigate with a capable captain and lost the one moment of decision he had left. But the frigate's story was far from over. They were about to evolve in ways that even their builders had not imagined, starting with a discovery that changed everything they knew about how fast a hull could move through water. A ship's bottom after 6 months at sea looks like a small underwater city nobody wanted to build. Barnacles in colonies the size of dinner plates. Worm channels so deep that a man can push his finger into the wood up to the second knuckle. Weeds trailing in long green streamers that drag against the water with every foot the ship moves forward. A hull this fouled is not just slower. It is fighting the ocean on every single tack, burning wind energy that should be driving it forward into the massive friction of biological growth. The navies of the 1700s understood this problem well. The traditional solution was grounding the ship at low tide or hauling it onto a beach and burning the growth off with torches and scrapers, then painting the bare wood with a mixture of tar, sulphur and tallow that smelled terrible and worked for a few months before the process started again. This was time-consuming. It was dangerous. It required a beach or a careening dock, which in mid-ocean or on a hostile coast was not available. And it was impermanent. Pirates who knew a Navy ship's careening schedule could sometimes predict where it would be, and when it would be vulnerable. The idea of using copper below the waterline had been tested experimentally for decades before it became standard practice. Early attempts ran into an unexpected problem. The copper reacted chemically with the iron bolts that held the ship's structure together and accelerated their corrosion, weakening the hull from the inside even as the copper protected it from the outside. The solution required switching to copper and bronze fasteners throughout the underwater section of the hull, which was expensive and required rebuilding large sections of many ships. The Royal Navy, characteristically methodical once it had decided something worked, began systematically copper-sheathing its fleet beginning in the 1770s, converting ships in batches as they came in for regular maintenance. The results were measurable and immediate. Ships that had previously needed careening every 3 or 4 months stayed clean and fast for 6 months, sometimes longer. Frigates on extended patrols in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean could maintain their speed advantage over the entire duration of a voyage without losing it to biological fouling. A frigate that arrived at the end of a 3-month patrol moving at 8 knots was just as dangerous as the same frigate leaving port. For pirates in fouled, slow vessels, this change was devastating. The brief window where a long patrolling frigate might be slow enough to escape from narrowed to nearly nothing. The copper revolution also had a secondary effect that nobody fully predicted. Because ships stayed at sea longer between careening, captains started ranging further from their bases, pushing into waters they had previously avoided because the resupply logistics were too difficult. Frigates began appearing in corners of the ocean where pirates had felt relatively safe simply because the nearest naval base was too far away. That expanding reach of the frigate had consequences that stretched well beyond the pirate trade. It was about to become the backbone of something much larger, a young country's decision to build its own fleet from scratch. The smell hits you first. Close your eyes and imagine being lowered into the berthing deck of a frigate at sea in the 1780s. Hundreds of men in a space that, on land, you might use for a modest warehouse. The air is thick with unwashed bodies, salt, tar, the faintly sweet rot of damp wood, the smoke from the cooking stove that filters up from the galley below. In warm latitudes, the heat is significant. In northern waters, the damp cold works into everything, including the hammocks where men sleep in rows so tight that the canvas presses against the man beside you. Each sailor is allocated 14 inches of horizontal space in which to sling his hammock. 14 inches, slightly wider than a sheet of paper turned lengthwise. At night, in the dark, with the ship rolling and the hammock swaying in rhythm, men learned to sleep in this space or they did not sleep at all. Meals were eaten in messes, groups of 8 men who shared a table that folded up when not in use. The food on a well-run frigate was monotonous but caloric. Salt pork or beef, boiled until the salt leached out enough to eat it. Hard biscuit, which sailors called hardtack and which was exactly what the name suggests. A dry, dense cracker that kept for months because nothing, including appetite, could damage it. Dried peas, occasionally oatmeal or cheese, and rum, a daily ration of half a pint mixed with water, called grog. The grog was important. Fresh water stored in wooden casks went stale and sometimes foul on a long voyage. The alcohol in grog suppressed the bacteria enough to make it safer than water alone. Sailors who received their daily grog ration were healthier on average than those on ships where it was withheld. Despite the conditions, men formed deep attachments to their ships and their messmates. The 8 men of a mess cooked together, ate together, argued together, covered for each other during duties. They pooled small amounts of personal money for better food when the ship was in port. They shared news of family, told stories, played cards on off-watch hours. This community was the emotional core of life on a frigate. The captain had authority. The lieutenants had rank. But the mess was home. When the order came to go to quarters to prepare for battle, the mess table was folded away. The hammocks were stuffed into nets along the sides of the ship, where they provided a small amount of protection from splinters, and the world below the gun deck transformed into something else entirely. Buckets of sand scattered across the planks to absorb blood and prevent slipping. Boys taking their positions near the magazine hatch. Gun crews checking the tackles that controlled their cannon. The transformation from floating community to fighting machine took about 8 minutes on a well-drilled frigate. That readiness, built through repetition and shared hardship, was what made the frigate's guns effective in a way that a pirate crew with more freedom and less training simply could not match. But not everything that happened on those decks was straightforward discipline and camaraderie. Some of the people living on frigates were keeping secrets that the Navy, had it known, would have found very difficult to process. The flag flying at a ship's stern was supposed to tell you everything. A red, white and blue British ensign meant Royal Navy. A white ensign with a red cross meant the same on different vessels. A merchant flag, lower on the hierarchy, meant a trading ship and usually an easier target. A black flag with a skull, or a red flag, meant a pirate and a different kind of conversation entirely. But anyone who actually sailed in the 1700s understood that flags were costumes, not identities. Every experienced captain carried multiple flags and used them as tools. A pirate captain approaching a merchant vessel might fly a friendly British or Dutch flag to get close without triggering alarm. A navy captain hunting a specific known pirate might fly no flag at all, or a false one, to avoid announcing his presence until he was close enough that running became impossible. This practice had a formal name, showing false colours, and it occupied a complicated ethical and legal space in maritime law. The accepted convention was that a ship had to show its true colours before firing. Flying a false flag to get close was considered acceptable. Opening fire while still flying a false flag was considered treacherous. Pirates generally did not spend much time on the distinction. The system of naval signals used between friendly ships was elaborate and deliberately difficult to fake. Books of signal codes, updated regularly, allowed frigates in a squadron to communicate across miles of open water using combinations of coloured flags and pennants, run up specific positions on the mast. A frigate seeing another ship fly the correct day's recognition signal knew it was a friendly vessel. Seeing the wrong signal or no signal was information in itself. Some pirates captured signal books in raids on merchant or naval vessels and used them to pose as friendly ships long enough to approach their target. This worked occasionally and spectacularly, then stopped working once the captured book was reported and the codes were changed. The frigate captains hunting pirates developed their own deceptions. One documented approach involved a frigate sailing parallel to a pirate vessel at a distance, flying merchant colours, allowing the pirates to catch up slowly, and then, when the pirates were committed to the boarding approach and too close to turn away, running out the guns and showing the true flag. The pirates, now within range and committed to a course, had very limited options. This kind of manoeuvring required good seamanship and nerve. A captain who showed false colours too long, or mistimed the moment of revealing his guns, risked a boarding action from a desperate crew before he had his own men at their stations. The whole game of signals and deception was about managing information. Whoever knew more about the other ship, its identity, its speed, its crew strength, its intentions, held the advantage. And in the 1700s, that information could only be gathered through observation, intelligence from port informants, and the careful reading of a ship's behaviour at a distance. A frigate captain who had been at sea for 20 years could identify a ship's approximate origin and purpose from the cut of its sails and the way it sat in the water before he could read the flag at all. That knowledge was hard to fake, and it was about to become even more valuable as the game moved to a new ocean entirely, one that would decide the future of a new nation. The problem with relying on the British Navy to protect your merchant ships is that it stops working the moment Britain becomes your enemy. The American colonies learned this lesson very directly in 1775, when the Revolution began and the most powerful navy in the world switched from being a protector to being a threat. British frigates that had previously kept pirates away from American merchant vessels were now blockading American ports, seizing American ships, and impressing American sailors into British service. The Continental Congress, the governing body of the newly independent colonies, made a decision that seemed audacious given the circumstances: build a navy. The resources were scarce. There were almost no purpose-built warships in American hands. There were plenty of shipwrights and timber. The forests of New England and the mid-Atlantic states were among the finest shipbuilding resources in the world, but designing and constructing proper warships was a different skill from building fishing boats or merchant brigs. The Continental Navy began commissioning frigates in 1775. The ships were given patriotic names and built in shipyards from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. They were smaller and lighter than their British counterparts in most cases, reflecting the available materials and the speed with which they needed to be built. Their mission was not to defeat the British Navy in open battle. That was impossible. Their mission was to threaten British merchant shipping, to force the British to divert naval resources to protect their own trade routes, and to occasionally pick off isolated British warships operating alone. The results were mixed during the Revolution itself. Some American frigates were captured, some were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. A few achieved genuine successes, capturing British ships and raiding supply lines in ways that had real strategic effect. What the Revolution proved was that Americans could build and operate frigates effectively, and that those ships provided a capability the young nation needed urgently to protect its growing maritime trade. After independence, American merchant ships discovered a new problem. Without the protection of the British flag, they were targets for pirates and privateers across the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The Barbary states of North Africa, a group of powers along the northern African coast, had been extracting tribute payments from European nations for the right to sail in Mediterranean waters without being attacked. Britain had paid these tributes and its ships were protected. American ships were now on their own. The depredations grew serious. American sailors were taken captive in North Africa and held for ransom. Merchant captains refused certain routes. Trade was disrupted. The new American government debated whether to pay tribute or build warships. The debate was fierce. Some argued that a navy was too expensive for a young republic. Others argued that paying tribute was an admission of weakness that would invite more demands. The warship faction won. The Naval Act of 1794 authorised the construction of 6 frigates. They were to be the finest frigates afloat. The designer, a man named Joshua Humphreys, had strong opinions about what that meant, and those opinions were about to produce something that would shock the most experienced naval officers in Europe. Joshua Humphreys believed American frigates should be able to defeat any enemy frigate afloat and outrun anything they couldn't defeat. This was a radical idea. Conventional warship design accepted trade-offs. A fast ship was lightly built. A heavily built ship was slow. You picked your priority and accepted the limitation. Humphreys, a Philadelphia shipwright with decades of experience and very specific ideas about American naval needs, decided to reject that trade-off. His argument was simple. America had no naval bases scattered across the Atlantic. If an American frigate got into a fight it couldn't win, it had nowhere to retreat to and no friendly harbour to limp into for repairs. So the ship had to be capable of winning most fights and running from the ones it couldn't win. He designed a vessel that was longer than a standard European frigate of the same rated gun count, with a heavier keel, thicker planking, and diagonal reinforcing timbers inside the hull that transferred stress more efficiently and made the whole structure dramatically more rigid. The live oak timber from the sea islands of Georgia and South Carolina, a species denser and tougher than ordinary oak, went into the most critical structural areas. The ship that embodied his design most completely was the Constitution, launched in Boston in 1797. It was rated as a 44-gun frigate, meaning naval convention assigned it that number, though it often sailed with more. It was longer and heavier than a standard European 36 or 38-gun frigate, but because of Humphrey's structural innovations, it was also faster and could carry its guns in rougher seas without the structural fatigue that plagued other ships of its weight class. The Constitution first saw action in the Quasi-War with France in the late 1790s, a naval conflict that involved no formal declaration of war but a great deal of actual fighting in the Caribbean. American frigates performed well, capturing several French vessels and demonstrating that Humphrey's designs worked in practice. Then came the Barbary Wars. The new American government, rather than continuing to pay tribute to the North African states, sent a squadron of frigates to the Mediterranean in 1801 to force the issue militarily. The Constitution was part of that force, and the experience of projecting naval power across the Atlantic shaped how American naval officers thought about frigates for a generation. The ship's most famous moment came later, in the War of 1812 against Britain, when it encountered the British frigate Guerrière in August of that year. The Guerrière fired a broadside at close range. The iron balls struck the Constitution's thick hull and, in several documented cases, appeared to bounce away or break apart on contact with the dense live oak planking. A British sailor reportedly shouted that the ship's sides were made of iron. The name stuck. Old Ironsides. The battle lasted about 30 minutes. The Guerrière was dismasted and so badly damaged she had to be destroyed at sea. The Constitution sailed away with moderate damage and a reputation that made it the most famous warship in American history. It still exists. Docked in Boston, it is the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. You can walk its deck, touch its guns, stand at the bow and look out across the harbour. And somewhere in the history held in those timbers, there is a line that runs straight back to the pirate lookout on a converted sloop off the Jamaican coast, pressing a spyglass to his eye on a bright morning, seeing the shape on the horizon and feeling the bottom drop out of the day. The Mediterranean in 1801 is not a peaceful sea. Along the northern coast of Africa, a stretch of territory controlled by a collection of semi-independent states, the rulers have a business model that has worked for over 2 centuries. Ships that want to pass through Mediterranean waters without being attacked pay a tribute, an annual sum delivered in cash, naval stores, or sometimes the ships themselves. Those who pay sail through. Those who refuse lose their ships and their crews. European powers, including Britain, France, and Spain, pay. It is cheaper than war and simpler than negotiation. The system is well established and mostly accepted as a cost of doing business in that part of the world. American merchants do not have that option anymore. Before the Revolution, American ships sailed under British protection, and British tribute arrangements covered them. After independence, they are on their own. For years, the young American government tries paying. The amounts demanded keep rising. At one point, tribute payments consume nearly 20% of the entire federal budget. American sailors are seized and held in North African prisons for years, some for over a decade, waiting for their government to pay ransoms it keeps promising and delaying. The situation forces a national argument. A country that built itself on principles of liberty is paying ransom for its citizens, while simultaneously building a navy it claims is too expensive to use. Something has to break. It breaks in 1801 when the Pasha of Tripoli, frustrated with what he considers an insufficient tribute, declares war on the United States by cutting down the flagpole in front of the American consulate. It is a theatrical gesture, but it is also a formal declaration, and it requires a response. President Thomas Jefferson, who has always opposed naval spending, now finds himself ordering a squadron of frigates into the Mediterranean. He does not go to Congress for a formal declaration of war. He frames it as a defensive action. The frigates go anyway. What follows over the next 4 years is the first overseas military campaign in United States history. American frigates blockade Tripoli harbour. They exchange fire with shore batteries. They capture and lose ships. One frigate, the Philadelphia, runs aground on a reef outside Tripoli harbour in 1803 and is captured intact with its entire crew of over 300 men. A young naval officer named Stephen Decatur sails a small vessel into the harbour at night, boards the captured Philadelphia with a raiding party, sets it on fire to prevent its use by the enemy, and escapes under cannon fire from the shore. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson, watching from a distance, calls it the most daring act of the age. The war grinds on. The strategic turning point comes when American forces support a land march of a few hundred mercenaries and marines across the Libyan desert to capture the city of Derna from the landward side while a frigate bombards it from the sea. The combined pressure forces a negotiated end to the conflict in 1805. The tribute payments do not end immediately. A second Barbary War is still to come. But the message sent by sending frigates rather than payments reshapes how the young republic thinks about naval power. The frigate in these campaigns is doing something new. It is not chasing pirates on familiar waters close to home bases. It is operating thousands of miles from home in unfamiliar seas as the entire physical expression of a nation's will. The ship carries the flag. The flag carries the argument. The argument is backed by 30 guns and a crew that has been at sea for months with no expectation of relief. The psychological weight of that presence was about to become its own kind of weapon, in waters much closer to home. Picture standing on a merchant ship's deck in the early 1700s, and a large vessel is approaching from the windward side. It is moving smoothly, its sails full and drawing well, and at this distance you cannot quite make out the details, the flag, the gun arrangement, the number of men visible on deck. The captain beside you has a glass to his eye and he is very still. Then the gun ports open. Along the approaching ship's side, a row of dark squares that were closed and invisible a moment ago lifts open in a line, port after port after port, each one revealing the black cylindrical mouth of a cannon. It happens in sequence, from bow to stern, and the sound of it carries across the water a series of dull wooden knocks, like someone closing a long row of cabinet doors, except the content of these cabinets will cross the distance between the ships at roughly the speed of sound. That sight, that sequence of opening ports, is one of the most psychologically effective weapons the Age of Sail produced. It required no firing. It was a message, and the message was received instantly and completely. A frigate with its gun ports open and its crew visible at the guns was broadcasting several pieces of information simultaneously. The number of ports told you the gun count, and therefore the approximate class of the ship. The speed with which they opened told you the drill state of the crew. The angle of approach told you whether the captain intended a broadside engagement or a raking pass across your bow, which would send a line of cannonballs the entire length of your ship from front to back. Most merchant captains, confronted with this, stopped. They hove to, came up into the wind to slow the ship, and waited for the other vessel to close and make its intentions clear. This was the rational response. Fighting a frigate with the 4 or 6 small guns on a merchant ship was not a meaningful option. Pirates, who often operated converted merchant vessels with modest armament, faced the same arithmetic and usually came to the same conclusion. The decision to open gun ports before firing was deliberate psychological strategy on the part of frigate captains. A quick, clean surrender saved time, preserved the prize ship intact and avoided casualties on both sides. A fight, even one the frigate would certainly win, damaged rigging, killed and wounded crew members, and potentially damaged the prize to the point where it was worth less when taken to a prize court. Surrender was the preferred outcome. So captains learned to make surrender seem like the obvious and reasonable choice. Fly the correct flag at the correct moment. Open the ports in a smooth, unhurried sequence that communicated confidence rather than haste. Move to cut off the obvious escape routes before revealing your identity, so that when the flag finally went up and the ports came open, the The target was already in a position where running was not going to work. The whole sequence was theatre with guns as props. But the financial dimension of this theatre was more complicated than it appeared, because the frigates and their crews were not entirely motivated by duty. There was money in this, sometimes a great deal of it, and the prospect of prize money changed everything about who volunteered, how hard they fought, and what happened to the ships and crews they caught. A frigate crew in the 1700s could get rich. The system was called prize money, and it worked like a structured commission on theft, except legal. When a Royal Navy ship captured an enemy vessel, whether a pirate, an enemy warship, or a merchant ship from a country at war with Britain, the captured ship and its cargo were taken to a prize court. The court assessed the value and distributed the proceeds according to a fixed formula. The captain received 3/8 of the total. The officers split another portion. The crew divided the remainder among themselves. On a good prize, a frigate captain might clear several £1,000s from a single capture, the equivalent of years of normal salary. Senior officers might receive hundreds of pounds each. Even ordinary sailors at the bottom of the hierarchy could receive enough to pay off debts, send money home, or save enough to eventually buy land or start a small business. This system had predictable effects on behaviour. Frigate captains in prize-rich waters became intensely motivated hunters. A captain assigned to a West Indies station in a period of active conflict could capture enough vessels in a single year to become independently wealthy. Some did. Stories of officers retiring young and comfortable after successful prize-catching years were widely known and powerfully motivating. The crew felt the same pull. Sailors who had been pressed into service and had every reason to resent their situation could find themselves doing the arithmetic on prize shares during a chase. A single successful capture of a well-laden merchant vessel might represent 6 months of normal wages distributed to the crew members who participated. The prospect focused attention and motivated effort in ways that pure discipline and duty did not always manage. Prize money also shaped where frigates concentrated their efforts. Captains found reasons to patrol routes where rich prizes were likely. This was not always aligned with strategic naval needs. An admiral trying to maintain a blockade or protect a specific convoy route sometimes found that his frigate captains had quietly positioned themselves where the prizes were best, rather than where the orders indicated they should be. The system was not clean. Prize courts could be corrupt. The assessment of cargo value was sometimes manipulated. Junior officers complained that captains were claiming shares of prizes they had not personally participated in capturing. Senior officers at naval stations sometimes demanded a cut of prizes taken by ships under their command, even when those ships had operated independently. But the fundamental mechanism worked. It aligned private financial interest with the public goal of taking enemy ships off the water. For pirates, understanding this system mattered. A pirate captain who was captured with a rich cargo was not just facing legal jeopardy. He was simultaneously funding the careers of the men who had taken him. The irony was not subtle. The same wealth that made piracy attractive also made catching pirates attractive. Some pirate captains, understanding this, tried to make themselves poor targets by distributing captured cargo quickly to crews and allies before any frigate could intercept them. The logic was that a ship with nothing in its hold was worth less to a prize-hungry captain than a fully laden vessel, and a captain balancing strategic priorities might let a poor prize pass in favour of a richer one elsewhere. This worked sometimes, but it required a level of organisational sophistication that most pirate operations never achieved. And on board the frigates themselves, behind the prize money and the gun drills and the captain's authority, there were people living lives that official records almost never mentioned. The official crew list of a Royal Navy frigate in the 1700s contains no women's names. The official crew list is incomplete. Women sailed on naval ships throughout the Age of Sail. The historical record confirms this in fragments, through court-martial documents, pension records, newspaper accounts, and the occasional memoir of a naval officer who found the subject worth mentioning. The picture that emerges from these fragments is not of a rare exception. It is of a widespread, tacitly accepted practice that the official record-keeping simply chose not to document. Some women aboard frigates were wives of sailors or petty officers who'd received permission, formal or informal, to accompany their husbands. On extended voyages, particularly to stations where men would be based for years, captains sometimes allowed a small number of women to sail. They cooked, laundered, and sometimes served as nurses to the wounded during battle. At the Battle of the Nile in 1798, several women were documented below decks during the fighting, passing supplies and helping with the wounded. Others passed as men. The case of Hannah Snell is documented. She enlisted in the British Marines in the 1740s under a male name, served in a naval expedition to India, was wounded in the leg, and dressed her own wounds rather than let a surgeon discover her. She served for years before eventually revealing her identity and, remarkably, receiving a pension for her service. Her story was published and became widely read. She was not presented as a scandal. She was presented as a curiosity and, in many accounts, admiringly. Snell was not unique. Researchers combing naval records and pension applications have found multiple cases of women who served in disguise for periods ranging from months to years. The practical conditions of life on a ship, crowded, dark below decks with very little private space, make the maintenance of such a disguise seem nearly impossible. That it worked, repeatedly, says something about the degree to which people around these women chose not to notice. In some cases, the disguise was never formally revealed. A woman would serve, die in action, or from disease, and be recorded simply as a male sailor. On frigates specifically, the conditions of the gun deck during battle created a kind of anonymized chaos in which what mattered was function, not identity. A powder monkey who delivered cartridges reliably was a powder monkey. A gun crew member who held the linstock steady and touched it to the charge at the right moment when ordered was a gun crew member. The question of what was underneath the uniform was not the commanding officer's most pressing concern when cannonballs were in the air. The women who sailed on frigates, whether documented as such or not, were part of the machine that made those ships function. Their erasure from the official record is more about the limits of what official records were designed to capture than about their actual absence. The frigate's world was always larger and stranger than its paperwork suggested. And speaking of things larger than they appeared, the question of how a frigate compared to the absolute heaviest ships in any fleet, the enormous ships of the line, reveals a rivalry that shaped naval strategy in ways that still echo today. The ship of the line was the largest thing built by human hands in the 1700s. A first-rate ship of the line, the biggest class, might carry over 100 guns on 3 decks, with a crew of 800 or 900 men. The hull was massive, the breadth of a small house, the length of a football field from bow to stern. When a first-rate fired a full broadside, the combined weight of iron it threw was measured in half tons, and the sound and smoke of it could be heard and seen from miles away. These ships were floating fortresses. Confronting one in open battle was the naval equivalent of running into a moving building made of cannon, and they were almost useless for catching pirates. The problem was everything the first-rate's power came from. The weight of all those guns and the thickness of the hull needed to carry them made the ship slow and difficult to maneuver. It needed deep water, which meant it could not follow a pirate sloop into a shallow inlet or a coastal river mouth. Its enormous crew required constant supply, which meant long patrols far from support bases were logistically impractical. And its sheer presence was sometimes counterproductive. A first-rate ship of the line appearing on the horizon gave every pirate within 30 miles plenty of time to scatter into the nearest defensible coastal geography. The first rate was a blunt instrument in a situation that required a precise one. The frigate occupied the space between the giant and the sloop, and that space turned out to be exactly where most of the practical naval work of the age happened. Frigates escorted convoys of merchant ships on ocean crossings. They patrolled trade routes and kept them free of interference. They delivered dispatches and carried diplomats and transported gold. They served as the advance scouts of battle fleets, sailing ahead to find the enemy and report back. In fleet battles, frigates stayed on the edges. They were too valuable to risk in the brutal line-to-line pounding of a major action, and their captains received standing orders not to engage enemy ships of the line. Their role was to relay signals between the admiral and distant parts of the fleet, to pick up survivors from sinking ships, to tow disabled vessels out of danger. Between the great sea battles, which were actually rare, frigates were doing almost everything. Naval historians argue that frigates were the true workhorses of the age of sail in a way that the famous ships of the line were not. The great first rates spent significant portions of their careers at anchor in harbour, too expensive to operate continuously and too powerful to risk. A frigate was almost always at sea, almost always doing something. A first-rate captain might see one decisive fleet battle in his entire career. A frigate captain might fight a dozen single-ship actions, chase scores of suspicious vessels, escort hundreds of merchant convoys, and put in more sea miles in a single commission than a ship of the line accumulated in a decade. That constant presence at sea, in every season and weather, also meant that frigate crews faced the ocean's worst moods. And some of those encounters, in conditions where no enemy ship was involved at all, were the most terrifying episodes in the entire history of the frigate. It is 2 a.m, and there is no moon. The frigate is 3 hours into a pursuit, and the target is somewhere ahead in the dark, invisible, identifiable, only by the faint luminescence of its wake, where the ship's passage disturbs the phosphorescent organisms in the water. In daylight, this would be a straightforward chase. The frigate is faster, and the pirate sloop has nowhere to run on this stretch of open Atlantic. In daylight, the captain could read the target's sails, judge its angle, anticipate its turns, and cut it off before it reached the coastline. In this darkness, everything is harder. The officer of the watch is at the bow, staring forward. His eyes have been adapting to the dark for an hour, and he can see roughly what the human eye can see on a moonless night at sea, which is enough to make out shapes at about a quarter-mile on a clear night, less when there is cloud cover, almost nothing when the cloud comes down thick. Tonight the cloud is intermittent. The stars appear, vanish, appear again. Navigating by sound and smell is not a metaphor. Experienced sailors on a night chase listened for the sound of the other ship's hull in the water, a different note than the surrounding sea, slightly more regular, slightly higher. They smelled for the smoke of a cook fire if the pursued vessel had been foolish enough to light one. They watched the water surface for the slight compression and spread of a wake, which caught starlight differently than undisturbed water. The captain of the frigate is not asleep. He is at the stern, checking the compass heading, calculating. If the sloop has maintained its current course and speed for the 3 hours since the chase began, it is now approximately 9 miles ahead and slightly to the southwest, on a bearing that will bring it to within a few miles of a coastline with inlets he knows from previous patrols, shallow inlets where the frigate cannot go. The decision he has to make is whether to cut across the sloop's projected course, gambling that his estimate of its position is correct, or to maintain direct pursuit and accept that he may arrive at the inlets too late. He cuts. He orders the helmsman to change course 15 degrees to port, which will bring the frigate across the sloop's probable path at a point several miles ahead of where the sloop currently is. For the next hour, nothing is visible. The frigate drives through the dark on the new heading. The watch rotates. Men who are off duty try to sleep in their hammocks while the ship leans into a moderate sea, the hull groaning, the rigging vibrating in the wind. Then a lookout at the bow says a single word: sail. The shape is where the captain calculated it would be, crossing in front of the frigate's bow at perhaps 1.5 miles, running hard for the coast. The gunner is sent to prepare a bow chaser, one of the long cannon mounted at the ship's prow for exactly this moment. A warning shot crosses in front of the sloop. The sloop does not stop. A second shot closer. The sloop changes course, turning away from the coast, turning toward the frigate because the other options are gone now. It is going to fight. On the frigate's gun deck, men who were sleeping a few minutes ago are at their stations. The ports are being opened. The tackles on the guns are being freed. What happens in the next 20 minutes will be determined by how well each crew has been prepared for exactly this moment. And sometimes, rarely but memorably, the outcome was not what anyone expected. The enemy the frigate most often lost to was not a pirate. Storms hit with a speed that still surprises even experienced sailors who have watched weather patterns for decades. A Caribbean hurricane in the 1700s moved faster than any ship could outrun and hit harder than any broadside. A North Atlantic gale in January produced waves that could sweep a deck clear of everyone standing on it and drive green water through gun ports left imperfectly sealed. A frigate's design, low to the water and long, was good for speed and stability in normal sea conditions and moderate rough weather. In a true storm, that same low profile became a vulnerability. Waves broke over the bow and ran the length of the deck. If a gun port was not fully closed and battened, water entered the gun deck and went below. The logbooks of frigates that survived severe storms are remarkable documents. Officers wrote in brief, controlled language about conditions that clearly terrified them. Masts carried away, men lost overboard, pumps running continuously for 36 hours to keep pace with the water coming in through sprung planks, the ship rolling so far that the mast tips swept close to the wave tops. Several frigates did not survive. The HMS Penelope ran ashore on the coast of Cuba in a storm in 1798. The HMS Ambuscade was wrecked on the coast of South Africa. The HMS Anson went down off the Cornwall coast in 1807, and over 100 people died in the wreck, close enough to shore that some survived by clinging to wreckage and being pulled out by local people. The loss of a frigate near a populated coast created a particular kind of tragedy. Survivors who could see land and sometimes reach it, and dead who washed ashore for days. When a frigate sank far from land, the crew's situation was nearly hopeless. A few could cram into small boats, the longboat and the jolly boat that most frigates carried. Those boats were designed for harbour work and short passages, not open ocean survival. In cold North Atlantic water, the typical survival time without protection from immersion was measured in minutes. Some crews survived remarkable hardships. After a wreck on a remote coast, they might spend weeks building a makeshift shelter, rationing what food washed ashore, and eventually constructing a vessel from wreck timber capable of reaching a port. Some of these improvised journeys covered hundreds of miles. Others died where they landed. The reefs of the Caribbean were among the most dangerous hazards. Coral reefs extend close to the surface, are often invisible from a distance, and can hole a ship within seconds of contact. Night approaches to unfamiliar coastlines produced a significant proportion of the wrecks in the historical record. The frigate captain who had spent 3 days in a chase and was running toward a familiar anchorage in the dark had reduced his margin of error to almost nothing. These wrecks left something behind, though. Objects from a frigate, ballast stones, cannon, ceramic jars, copper sheathing, glass bottles, navigational instruments, lie on the seafloor, sometimes perfectly preserved by cold or anaerobic sediment. And what comes up from those wrecks centuries later tells a story that no document can. It happened, rarely dramatically, and against every expectation that the math of the situation suggested. The most famous case involves a pirate named Bartholomew Roberts, who we have already met in his final defeat, but whose career began with a capture that set the pattern for his entire legend. In 1719, Roberts was not yet a captain. He was a mate aboard a slave ship called the Princess, operating off the West African coast. A pirate crew under a captain named Howell Davis captured the Princess and pressed Roberts into service. Weeks later, Davis was killed in an ambush ashore. The pirates needed a new captain. They voted, and they chose Roberts, who had been with them for only 6 weeks. Roberts transformed within months from reluctant conscript to the most feared pirate on the Atlantic. He was disciplined, tactical, and willing to take audacious risks. He raided a Portuguese fleet of 42 ships and managed to take one of the richest prizes before the escort warships could react. He captured a heavily armed Royal Navy vessel off Newfoundland, not by overpowering it gun to gun, but by positioning his ship at a moment when the Navy vessel could not bring its broadside to bear. That kind of tactical precision, finding the angle where a bigger ship was temporarily weaker, was the pirate answer to superior firepower. The most audacious capture of a near-frigate-class vessel in the Caribbean came during the period when the pirate Edward Lowe was operating. Lowe's crew boarded a man-of-war equivalent by coming alongside at night in small boats, climbing the hull and overwhelming the watch before an alarm could be raised. The crew was asleep and the watch was small. The pirates had the ship before anyone below decks understood what was happening. These stories spread fast, through port taverns and ship's crews, and they did 2 things simultaneously. They terrified naval officers who had assumed their ships were safe from boarding in normal anchorage, and they terrified pirate crews who understood that any captain stupid or desperate enough to try this with a fully alert frigate would end up dead on the deck within 3 minutes. The successful captures were the exception, and they succeeded through timing, surprise, or the exploitation of a specific and temporary weakness, a small watch, an unlucky angle, a fog bank. Against a prepared frigate with its crew at stations, a pirate boarding attempt was simply an organised way to kill your own men. But the exception mattered enormously to how both sides thought. Frigate captains began requiring larger night watches and more stringent anchor protocols. Pirate captains with ambitions toward capturing a warship started paying attention to patterns. When ships rotated their watches, when crews were paid and might be drunk ashore, when a frigate's captain was at a governor's dinner and the first lieutenant had less experience. The cat and mouse game never simplified into a clean formula, and over time, the cats were winning. The Golden Age was ending, pressed out of existence by a combination of frigates, better naval organisation, and the slow economic recovery that gave desperate sailors legal employment again. The age of piracy did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. It faded. Piracy did not end because one famous pirate was killed. It ended because the conditions that made piracy possible were systematically dismantled, and frigates were the primary instrument of that dismantling. The mechanism was presence, sustained, expensive, boring, unglamorous presence. A frigate on permanent station in the Caribbean meant that merchant ships on that route had a reasonable expectation of protection. When merchant captains knew that a frigate was patrolling the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, they routed their ships through that passage with greater confidence. Insurance rates on those routes fell. More ships used them. The economic value of piracy on those routes dropped, because capturing a ship there now carried a high probability of encountering a frigate before you could get the prize to safety. Pirates, like any group of people operating an economic activity, responded to changing risk and reward. When the risk of operating in a specific area rose high enough, they moved. They pushed into less patrolled waters, towards smaller targets, toward routes where the reward was lower, but the probability of survival was higher. This is documented in the historical record of piracy during the 1720s. After the sustained Royal Navy patrols began in the Caribbean following 1718, the epicenter of Golden Age piracy shifted toward West Africa and the edges of the Indian Ocean trade. Those waters were less regularly patrolled and offered different targets. The frigates followed. Not immediately, not in overwhelming numbers, but steadily. Each new patrol station established, each new frigate added to a route, compressed the operating space available to pirate captains. The economics of piracy also changed from the shoreside. Nassau, which had functioned as an open pirate base in the 17-teens, became a legitimate colonial port under Woodes Rogers' governorship. Pirates who used it as a base were now criminals operating in a place with functioning law enforcement, rather than guests in an anarchic haven. The supply networks that had fed pirate vessels, the merchants who sold them provisions, the shipwrights who careened their hulls, the factors who sold their stolen goods, all of these came under legal pressure. Remove the shore infrastructure and a pirate ship becomes a vessel that cannot sustain itself at sea. Frigates cannot be everywhere at once, but if they are everywhere enough of the time that pirate captains cannot reliably get in and out of port to resupply, the trade becomes impossible to maintain. By the 1730s, the Golden Age was functionally over. Individual pirate acts continued. They have never fully stopped across any period of maritime history. But the organised, semi-open commerce of the 17-teens and early 20 years, hundreds of ships operating out of shared bases, preying on the richest trade routes in the world with limited opposition, that was gone. The frigates had strangled it, slowly and methodically over roughly 15 years, and those same frigates, having accomplished that task, were about to enter the largest conflict the world had yet produced, where their role would expand beyond anything their builders had imagined. When Napoleon Bonaparte looked at a map of Europe in 1805, he saw a continent he could control by land, and one problem he could not solve at sea: Britain, an island nation that had been building frigates and training sailors for over a century, that controlled the approaches to every major European port, that could put a blockading fleet off any coastline it chose and maintain it there indefinitely. Napoleon's armies had never lost a major land battle at this point in his career, but he could not march his infantry across the English Channel. The frigates that had chased pirates in the Caribbean were now the scouts and messengers of the greatest naval war in European history, and their role had evolved into something that required a completely different kind of skill. Fleet intelligence during the Napoleonic Wars depended on frigates the way modern military operations depend on satellites. An admiral commanding a fleet of ships of the line needed to know where the enemy fleet was at all times, what direction it was moving, how many ships it contained, and whether it had been reinforced or damaged. The ships of the line could not go look for this information themselves. They were too slow, too visible, too valuable to risk on a scouting mission. Frigates went. A frigate captain on intelligence duty operated with enormous independence. He might be ordered to locate the French fleet, last seen leaving Toulon, and report its course. Finding a fleet in an ocean before the age of radio meant sailing to the last known position, reading the weather, thinking about where a fleet with those orders would logically go, and then sailing through the night and the following days until you found it, or found information from other ships that told you where it was. This required navigational skill, tactical judgment, and a kind of controlled boldness. A frigate that found an enemy fleet had to get close enough to count ships and assess readiness while staying outside effective cannon range. A well-handled frigate could shadow an enemy fleet for days at long range, watching it, reporting by sending dispatch boats to the admiral, staying just far enough away that the enemy could not cut it off. At Trafalgar in 1805, the battle that effectively ended Napoleon's hope of ever defeating the Royal Navy, frigates held their positions on the edge of the action, watching the line of battle develop, ready to rescue survivors and carry dispatches. When the fighting ended and the full scale of the British victory became clear, a frigate carried the news to England. The dispatch reached London in days, which was fast across the width of the Atlantic in sailing conditions. Nelson was dead. The French fleet was destroyed. The war at sea was effectively decided, though the land war would continue for another decade. And in the aftermath of all that destruction, the ships that had carried the weight of the contest began to change in ways that made everything that came before them look temporary. The wooden age was ending, and the frigate, which had defined naval warfare for over a century, was about to become something almost unrecognisable. The last wooden frigate looked, to the untrained eye, almost exactly like the first one. Same general proportions, same arrangement of masts, same gun ports. But the ships that came after, the ones that historians call steam frigates, looked like something from a different world, because they were. The change came in stages, which is how most revolutions in technology actually happen. The first steam-powered warships appeared in the 1820s and 30s, and they were awkward compromises, paddle wheels mounted on the sides of what were otherwise fairly conventional hulls, vulnerable to cannon fire in exactly the location that mattered most in a battle. The solution was the screw propeller, mounted under the stern where it was protected by the hull. A frigate with a screw propeller could move under steam with no visible machinery on the outside of the ship. From a distance, in calm conditions, it looked like an ordinary sailing frigate. Then it moved without wind, without sails even deployed, and the illusion collapsed. Steam changed the calculation that had governed naval warfare since ships had sails. Wind was no longer the deciding variable. A steam-powered frigate could pursue a sailing vessel in calm weather, when the sailing ship sat dead in the water and was helpless. It could maneuver against the wind, which no sailing ship could do. It could maintain a specific position on a blockade regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. For pirates, the brief window of hope that calm weather or headwinds had sometimes provided, moments when a frigate sat becalmed while a pirate vessel with oars or a different hull form made progress, closed entirely. The transition from wood to iron happened in parallel. Iron hulls were stronger for their weight, did not rot, did not get shipworm. They could be built to larger dimensions than wood, because there were no structural limits on iron frame size the way there were limits on timber length and straightness. The first iron-hulled warships appeared in the 1840s and 50s. The combination of iron hulls and steam power made the wooden sailing frigate obsolete within roughly 30 years. The American Civil War in the 1860s produced ironclad warships that could absorb wooden cannon fire without damage and whose own guns tore through wooden hulls as though they were paper. A wooden frigate facing an ironclad was not a contest. The last generation of officers who had commanded wooden frigates watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and grief. These men had learned to read wind and weather the way others read text. Their entire professional identity was built around the mastery of canvas and rope, and the behaviour of a wooden hull in a running sea. The new ships required different knowledge, engineering rather than seamanship, fuel consumption rather than wind angles. The age of the wooden frigate ended. But something survived the transition, something that no iron hull or steam engine could contain. It went underwater. A frigate that sank in the 1700s did not disappear. It settled into the seafloor and began a different kind of existence, one governed by chemistry and pressure and the slow work of marine organisms rather than wind and the decisions of human beings. In cold water, below the depth where sunlight reaches and where oxygen levels drop, organic material breaks down very slowly, In anaerobic sediment, the kind that builds up in protected bays and river mouths where there is no current to stir it, wooden objects can last for centuries in remarkable condition. When marine archaeologists began systematically studying naval wrecks in the 20th century, what they found changed what we know about life at sea in the age of the frigate. The wreck of the HMS Endeavour, recovered in part from the harbour of Newport, Rhode Island in recent years, yielded objects of mundane intimacy that no document had preserved. Personal items, a leather shoe, a pewter spoon, a button with a regimental marking that identified not just the ship but the individual man who had worn the jacket it once fastened. These small objects carry information that the official record concerned with dates, battles, and command decisions never bothered to capture. Cannon recovered from wreck sites tell their own stories. Examination of frigate cannon under modern analysis reveals details about casting quality, the metals used, the wear patterns that indicate how frequently a particular gun was fired, whether it was cared for or neglected. Some guns show evidence of previous damage and improvised repair, signs of a vessel that kept fighting past the point where proper maintenance was possible. The copper sheathing found on wreck sites after the 1770s is so well preserved in some locations that the individual nail holes are still sharp and the original surface texture is visible. Researchers have used the patterns of sheathing wear to estimate a ship's speed and the conditions it habitually sailed in, information about performance that no captain's log recorded. Personal medicine chests from surgeons' kits recovered from wrecks contain glass bottles still sealed, their contents preserved well enough for chemical analysis. What those bottles held tells us about what injuries and illnesses naval surgeons treated most frequently, and the treatments they had available. The gap between what the medicine cabinet contained and what modern medicine knows would have helped is sometimes heartbreaking. The wrecks also settle debates that historical documents left ambiguous. The distribution of objects within a wreck, which areas of the ship they come from, tells archaeologists about how space was used, where different crew groups lived and worked, how stores were organised. Some assumptions about frigate life that historians had carried for decades have been quietly revised by wreck evidence. There are hundreds of naval wrecks from the age of sail that have never been excavated. Many more have never been located. Every storm season shifts sediment, occasionally exposing the outline of a hull that has been buried for 200 years. The ocean floor is still giving up information about a world that thought it had vanished. And above water, in libraries, and in the imaginations of readers who never touched a frigate in their lives, a different kind of preservation was happening. The frigate became a literary obsession almost immediately. Sailors who survived extraordinary voyages and battles wrote memoirs while the experience was still raw. Officers and captains, educated men who had spent years at sea with few other intellectual occupations, filled journals with observations about ships, weather, ports, and the behaviour of men under stress. Some of these journals were eventually published and became widely read. By the late 1800s, novelists had discovered that the wooden frigate and the world it inhabited offered everything a story needed: confined space, absolute hierarchy, distance from civilization, the constant possibility of violent death from multiple directions, characters thrown together from every class of society and forced to function as a unit. The ocean as a setting that was simultaneously beautiful and lethal. The frigate novel became its own genre. The stories centred on capable young officers learning the craft of seamanship and command, gradually earning the trust of their crews, navigating both the tactical challenges of sea warfare and the human complexity of life in an isolated community. The best of these novels were meticulously researched and accurate in their technical detail, but they worked as literature because the emotional truth of the setting was so powerful. Patrick O'Brien's series of novels following a Royal Navy captain and his ship's surgeon across the Napoleonic Wars became one of the most praised historical fiction sequences of the 20th century. O'Brien spent decades researching the period, and his novels reconstruct the sensory world of a frigate, the food, the smell, the sound of the rigging in different winds, the specific terminology of seamanship, with a precision that naval historians found remarkable. Readers who had never been within a mile of the ocean found themselves understanding instinctively what it meant to beat to windward in a freshening gale. C.S. Forrester's Hornblower novels did the same thing for an earlier generation of readers, and were partly responsible for inspiring a significant number of men who served in naval roles during the Second World War. The real captains behind the fictional ones were equally compelling. Thomas Cochrane, a Royal Navy officer whose career was so extraordinary, and so filled with improbable victories against larger forces that novelists borrowed liberally from it, was a frigate captain who captured a larger Spanish vessel by bluff and a willingness to take a risk that should not have worked. His life was eventually adapted directly into films and novels. The frigate in literature became the vehicle for a very specific fantasy. The fantasy of the capable individual who knows their world completely, who can read wind and weather and men, who makes decisions under impossible pressure and sometimes, through skill and nerve and a little luck, comes out the other side intact. That fantasy did not belong only to the past. It turns out the word frigate itself had not finished travelling through history. Walk into a modern naval base and you will hear the word frigate used without any sense of irony or nostalgia. It is a current term, active, applied to steel warships powered by gas turbines, equipped with radar arrays and missile systems, carrying helicopters on their rear decks and sonar equipment hanging below the waterline. These ships bear almost no physical resemblance to the vessels that chased Bartholomew Roberts across the West African coast, and yet the word stuck. Naval terminology is conservative in a specific way. The functions that different types of ships perform tend to persist even as the technology that accomplishes those functions changes completely. A frigate in 1720 performed the roles of scouting, escorting, and independent hunting. A modern frigate in the world's major navies performs recognizable versions of the same roles. Modern frigates escort larger vessels, including aircraft carriers, and protect them from submarines, aircraft, and missile attacks. They patrol sea lanes and enforce maritime law in their nation's exclusive economic zones. They conduct independent operations in distant waters for extended periods. They are smaller, faster, and more versatile than the destroyers and cruisers above them in the naval hierarchy, and they operate in roles that the big ships cannot efficiently fill. The United States Navy, which phased out a class of ships it called frigates in 2015, announced in 2020 that it was building a new class called the Constellation class, frigates again, designed for exactly this kind of versatile, independent, sustained sea control work. The design conversation around modern frigates echoes Humphrey's arguments about the Constitution in ways that would have been recognizable to him. How do you balance speed against survivability? How much armament can you carry before the weight affects performance? How far can the ship operate from a home base before the logistics become unmanageable? The answers involve different variables now. Fuel consumption rather than wind angles, radar cross-section rather than hull visibility, electronic warfare rather than signal flags. But the underlying questions have not changed. What changed is the enemy. The pirates of the Golden Age are long gone. The frigates that hunt modern maritime threats are chasing different kinds of ships, different kinds of threats, across the same water. The ocean is the same ocean. The trade routes are the same trade routes, carrying different goods in steel containers rather than wooden barrels, but moving between the same continents for the same fundamental economic reasons. And the frigate in some form is still out there. It is easy to tell the story of the frigate as a story about ships and captains and guns. It was also a story about everyone else. The merchant captain who sailed the sugar route from Jamaica to Bristol in 1722 was not a dramatic figure. He was a careful man with a ledger and a cargo that belonged to people who had invested real money in it. People who had no way of knowing, until the ship arrived, whether it was still afloat. His voyage took roughly 6 weeks in good conditions. For those 6 weeks, his entire world was the ship, the crew, and whatever the horizon was doing. The frigate patrolling his route was a fact of geography on that voyage. He might see it, or he might not. He might hear in Nassau or Port Royal that a Navy vessel had been seen off the Windward Passage, which told him the route was probably clear. He might receive news that a pirate vessel had been taken the previous week, which told him something very specific about his odds. The frigate's presence changed the arithmetic of his voyage from very dangerous to merely risky. That difference, which sounds abstract, translated directly into whether ships made the voyage at all, whether merchants invested in cargo, whether the colonies could send their produce to market, whether the economic system that was building the empires of the 1700s could function. A sugar merchant in Bristol who never went near a ship in his life owed part of his prosperity to a frigate captain whose name he did not know, patrolling a route he could not find on a map. The same is true of the coastal town that slept with less fear because the sea lane outside it was being patrolled. The colonial family that got their mail because the dispatch ship made it through. The insurance company that could offer reasonable rates because the loss records had improved. The sailor's family in Portsmouth who received his pay because he came home rather than disappearing in a pirate attack. The frigate's impact was mostly invisible precisely because it worked. When it worked, nothing happened. Ships arrived, goods moved, the economy functioned, nobody wrote about it. The log entries were routine, the mail arrived. The moments when it did not work, when a pirate got through, when a merchant ship was taken, those made the records and the newspapers. The thousands of uneventful voyages that were uneventful because a frigate had been where it needed to be were recorded in the absence of bad news. History tends to preserve the dramatic and ignore the functional. The frigate's greatest achievement, measured in ships that arrived safely, in cargoes that were not stolen, in lives that were not lost, is almost unquantifiable precisely because it is the story of things that did not happen. Understanding that invisible protection changes how we read the entire age of sail. The ocean was not made safe by a few famous battles. It was made safer by continuous presence, continuous patrol, continuous readiness, accumulated across decades and thousands of square miles of sea. That understanding sits quietly in the last image of the frigate's story. The frigate is at anchor in a bay on the West Indian coast. The year is 1730. The sails are furled in loose bundles against the yards. The gun ports are closed. The anchor cable hangs straight down into clear water, and the ship swings slowly with the tide, pointing first this way, then that, in the rhythm that anchored ships always keep. Below decks, most of the crew is sleeping. They have been at sea for 11 weeks. The captain is in his cabin, writing in the log. The log entries for the patrol are quiet. A suspicious vessel approached and identified itself as a Dutch merchant. Papers in order, let go. A small island anchorage checked, found empty, sailed on. A report from a passing ship that a pirate vessel had been seen 3 weeks ago to the north. Course unknown, nothing found. The weather log, which takes up more space than anything else, records a moderate gale on the 28th day of the voyage, 1 man lost overboard and not recovered, 3 days of calms, a waterspout at a distance. He closes the log and looks out the stern windows at the harbour. The harbour is quiet. A few fishing boats move across the shallows, smoke from shore fires. the sound of waves against the hull steady and slow. Behind the frigate, the sea stretches back toward the horizon they have been sailing from for 11 weeks. That sea is empty. No strange sails. No shapes on the horizon that resolve into something dangerous. 3 years ago, this particular stretch of water was not safe. Merchant captains avoided it. Insurance premiums for ships using this route were nearly double what they were on less dangerous passages. A pirate fleet had used the small island to the north as a base and had taken 11 ships in the space of 14 months. The fleet is gone. 2 ships were taken in engagements with frigates. The others dispersed when the naval patrols became consistent enough to make the base too dangerous to use. The captain of the pirate fleet is in a prison in Port Royal, waiting for a trial that will almost certainly end in hanging. The merchant ships are using the route again. 2 passed yesterday, a week ahead of schedule because the wind had been favourable. The captain of one had waved from his quarterdeck as the frigate came into sight. A small gesture that carries, for anyone who knows what it means, a large amount of information about what the frigate's presence in those waters actually accomplished. The sea is empty. The sea being empty is the point. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon the frigate has just come from, other captains are doing the same work on different water. Other crews are sleeping in hammocks slung at 14-inch intervals, eating hardtack, standing watch in the dark, learning to read the night sky and the colour of the water and the behaviour of birds that indicate land at a distance. The age of the great pirate captains is ending. The sea lanes of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are becoming slowly, reliably, more predictable places. Not safe. The sea is never entirely safe, but safer than they were, and the ship at anchor in this quiet bay, its crew exhausted and alive, its hull marked by 11 weeks of salt and weather, its log full of unremarkable entries about vessels checked and found legitimate, is the reason. The lookout on the masthead is scanning the horizon from habit, from training, from the deep professional instinct of someone who has learned that the horizon is never just scenery. It is empty. He settles back against the mast and watches the sky change colour as the afternoon moves toward evening. The water below catches the light and holds it for a moment, gold and green and very still. And somewhere behind the horizon, another ship is already out there, making sure it stays that way.